Tommy knew every corner of the riverside mansion. He knew which floorboards creaked, which windows let in the most sunlight, and exactly how long it took to polish the grand staircase until it gleamed. But he didn't know these things because he lived there. He knew them because his mother worked there, and for the past 3 years, Tommy had been her shadow. Every day after school, the 12-year-old would catch the bus to the estate where his mother, Maria, worked as a housekeeper. While other kids his age were playing video games or hanging out at the park, Tommy would sit in the servants' quarters doing homework, trying his best to stay quiet and out of sight. The wealthy family who owned the mansion, the Harringtons, barely acknowledged him. To them, he was just part of the background, like the furniture or the paintings on the walls. Tommy didn't mind being invisible most of the time. It was easier that way. No awkward conversations, no pitying looks, no questions about why his mother cleaned houses while other moms had fancy office jobs. He'd learned early on that in places like this, some people were meant to be seen and others weren't. He fell into the second category, but there was one room in that enormous house that made Tommy feel different. One place where he didn't feel small or invisible or less than anyone else. That place was the music room. It wasn't a room he was supposed to enter. His mother had made that clear from day one. The music room was off limits to staff, and especially to a housekeeper's kid who had no business touching anything valuable. But every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, something magical happened. Mrs. Harrington would go upstairs for her nap, and his mother would be busy cleaning the bedrooms on the second floor. For exactly 45 minutes, Tommy had the music room to himself. The first time he'd slipped inside had been almost by accident. He'd been wandering the hallway, bored out of his mind, when he'd heard something. Not a sound exactly, but more like the absence of sound, a deep, peaceful quiet that pulled him toward the closed door. He'd turned the handle slowly, half expecting an alarm to go off or someone to yell at him. Instead, he'd found paradise. The room was all windows and light, with books lining the walls and a thick carpet that made his footsteps silent. But the centerpiece, the thing that made Tommy's breath catch in his throat, was the piano. It was black and shiny, so big it seemed to fill half the room. He'd seen pianos before, of course, on TV and in movies, but he'd never been this close to one. Never stood close enough to smell the wood polish and see his reflection in its glossy surface. Tommy had reached out and touched one key, just barely pressing it down. The note that came out was pure and clear, hanging in the air like a question. He'd pressed another key, then another, hearing how the sounds were different but somehow belonged together. Something inside him woke up that day, something he didn't have words for. That was 2 years ago. Now at 14, Tommy had taught himself to play. Not well. Not like the professionals he watched on YouTube videos when he could get Wi-Fi at the public library, but he could play. He'd borrowed a book about reading music from school and studied it until the pages were worn. He'd drawn a keyboard on cardboard and practiced finger exercises while waiting for the bus. And every Tuesday and Thursday, for those precious 45 minutes, he played the real thing. He always kept the volume down, his fingers barely touching the keys, producing sounds so soft they wouldn't carry beyond the room. He taught himself scales first, then simple songs. Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star had taken him 3 weeks to master. Happy Birthday, another 2. But then he discovered classical music and everything changed. The first time Tommy heard Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, he'd been in the library killing time after school. The music had poured through his cheap earbuds and into his soul. It was sad and beautiful and angry all at once. It made him feel things he didn't know music could make you feel. That night he'd watched a video of someone playing it, watching their fingers move across the keys, memorizing every movement. It took him 4 months to learn even the first part. His technique was probably all wrong. He had no teacher to correct his hand position or tell him he was holding his wrist too high. But when he played, really played, none of that seemed to matter. The music came from somewhere deep inside him, from a place that had nothing to do with proper technique or expensive lessons. Tommy knew he was living on borrowed time. Sooner or later, someone would catch him. His mother would lose her job, and it would be his fault. The thought terrified him. They didn't have much, just a small apartment across town and his mother's steady paycheck. Losing this job would mean losing everything. But he couldn't stop. The piano had become as necessary to him as breathing. The Harrington family didn't appreciate what they had. Tommy had watched their daughter, a girl his age named Victoria, take lessons in that very room. She'd slouch at the bench, sighing dramatically while her expensive teacher tried to get her to practice scales. She had every advantage in the world and couldn't care less. It made Tommy's chest tight with frustration. If he had those opportunities, those lessons, that teacher's attention, he'd soak up every second of it. But wishes didn't change reality. Tommy was the housekeeper's son, and Victoria was the heiress to a fortune. They lived in different worlds even though they breathed the same air in the same house. His mother knew something was up. She'd caught him humming classical melodies while doing his homework, and had given him curious looks. One day she'd asked him where he'd learned that song, and he'd mumbled something about hearing it at school. Maria had looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face, but she hadn't pushed. His mother was good at not asking questions when she sensed the answers might complicate things. As Tommy sat in the servants' kitchen that Saturday evening, trying to focus on his algebra homework, he could hear music drifting from the ballroom. The Harringtons were throwing one of their fancy parties, the kind where people wore clothes that cost more than his mother made in a month. His mother had been working since early morning, helping prepare food and making sure every surface sparkled. The music playing wasn't recorded. Someone was performing live on that piano. His piano. Tommy felt a strange mixture of jealousy and curiosity. Who was playing? Were they any good? Without fully deciding to, he closed his textbook and stood up. Just a quick look, he told himself. Just to see. He made his way down the hall, staying close to the walls where the shadows were deepest. The ballroom doors were open, and he could see the crowd of well-dressed guests, champagne glasses in hand, all facing toward the front of the room. And there at the piano sat a young man Tommy had never seen before. The guy was probably in his early 20s, wearing an expensive suit and playing with the kind of confidence that came from years of professional training. But something was off. The notes were perfect, technically flawless, but they felt empty. Like someone reciting poetry without understanding what the words meant. Tommy found himself edging closer, drawn by both the music and something he couldn't name. He wanted to hear more. He needed to understand why this performance, played on the piano he loved by someone with all the training he'd never have, felt so hollow. He didn't realize he'd been noticed until a voice rang out across the room, cutting through the polite applause like a knife. Well, what do we have here? Tommy froze. Every head in the ballroom turned toward him. He felt like a deer caught in headlights, his heart hammering so hard he thought everyone must be able to hear it. The young man at the piano, who Tommy now realized must be related to the Harringtons, was staring at him with an amused smirk. "I asked you a question," the man said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "Are you lost?" "The kitchen is that way." He pointed toward the back of the house and several guests chuckled. Tommy's face burned. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor, but his feet wouldn't move. Somewhere in the crowd he spotted his mother. Maria's face had gone pale, her eyes wide with fear. This was exactly what she'd always worried about. Tommy drawing attention, causing problems, making waves that could cost her the job that kept food on their table. "I'm sorry," Tommy managed to whisper, but his voice was too quiet to carry across the room. "Speak up, boy," the young man said, standing from the piano bench. He was tall and confident, the kind of person who'd never doubted his place in the world. "You were watching my performance. Did you enjoy it?" Something in the man's tone made Tommy's embarrassment shift into something else. Anger, maybe, or frustration at years of being treated as less than, as invisible as someone who didn't matter. The words came out before he could stop them. "It was technically good," Tommy said, his voice steadier now, but it didn't have any feeling. The room went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on that expensive carpet. The young man's smirk faded, replaced by a look of disbelief that quickly morphed into anger. "Excuse me?" he said, taking a step toward Tommy. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" "I'm Christopher Harrington. I just finished 3 years at the Vienna Conservatory. I've studied under masters you've probably never even heard of." "Then they should have taught you that music is more than just hitting the right notes," Tommy said. Alden believed the words were coming out of his mouth, but now that he'd started, he couldn't seem to stop. Anyone can learn to play perfectly, but making people feel something, that's different. Christopher's face turned red. Several guests were whispering now, some looking shocked, others intrigued. Mrs. Harrington, the elderly matriarch of the family, was watching the exchange with raised eyebrows. She looked more curious than angry. "Oh, this is rich," Christopher said, laughing without humor. The helps kid is giving me music lessons. Tell me, where did you study? Which conservatory? Or did you learn everything you know from YouTube videos? The accuracy of that last jab stung, but Tommy held his ground. His mother had moved closer, her hand reaching out as if to pull him away. But Mrs. Harrington held up a finger, stopping her. "Let the boy speak," the old woman said, her voice carrying authority that made everyone pause. Christopher spun back to Tommy, his eyes glinting with malicious amusement. "You know what? I'll make this interesting. You clearly think you're some kind of expert, so why don't you show us what you've got?" He gestured toward the piano with exaggerated courtesy. "Please enlighten us all. Show us how music should really be played." Tommy's mouth went dry. This was different from his secret practice sessions. This was standing in front of 50 wealthy strangers who already thought he didn't belong there. One wrong move and his mother would be fired. They'd lose everything. "Christopher, that's enough," Mrs. Harrington said, for there was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't entirely opposed to seeing what would happen. No, Christopher insisted. "The boy has opinions about my playing. Surely he can back them up, unless he was just talking big." He looked at Tommy with challenge in his eyes. "What's the matter? All talk, no talent?" Tommy looked at his mother. Maria was shaking her head slightly, her eyes pleading with him to back down, to apologize, to save her job. Every logical part of Tommy's brain agreed with her. This was insane. He should walk away right now. But then he looked at Christopher's smug face, at all these people in their expensive clothes, assuming they already knew everything about him based on who his mother worked for. At the piano sitting there, the same instrument he'd poured his heart into for 2 years in secret. Something inside him made a decision. "Okay," Tommy said quietly. "I'll play." His mother's soft gasp was drowned out by the murmur of surprised voices. Christopher's grin widened. He thought this was going to be entertainment, watching the maid's son embarrass himself, proof that people knew their place for a reason. Tommy walked toward the piano, his legs feeling shaky but somehow carrying him forward. The crowd parted, guests moving aside with curious expressions. Some looked amused, others uncomfortable. A few seemed genuinely interested to see what would happen next. When Tommy reached the piano bench, he had to adjust it. Christopher was taller, and the seat was positioned for someone with longer legs. His hands were trembling as he set the height right. The Steinway looked different from this angle, with all those eyes on him. The keys seemed to gleam under the chandelier light, waiting. "This ought to be good," Christopher muttered, just loud enough for Tommy to hear. He'd moved to stand nearby, arms crossed, ready to enjoy the show. Tommy placed his fingers on the keys. They felt cool and familiar, like greeting an old friend. For a moment, all the fear melted away. It was just him and the piano, the way it had been every Tuesday and Thursday for 2 years. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Then he began to play. He chose Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the first piece that had made him fall in love with classical music. His fingers found the opening notes, those slow, haunting triplets that sounded like moonlight. Really did look like music. The room around him faded. There was no crowd, no Christopher, no fear of his mother losing her job. There was only the music. Tommy played from memory, the way he'd practiced 100 times in this very room when no one was watching. His technique wasn't perfect. His hand position was probably wrong in places. He was self-taught, and it showed. But what he lacked in formal training, he made up for in something else. Passion, understanding, soul. Each note carried weight. Each phrase told a story. Tommy wasn't just playing Beethoven. He was pouring every emotion he'd ever felt into those keys. The loneliness of being invisible. The frustration of having talent but no opportunity. The pure joy of music that made everything else bearable. All of it flowed through his fingers and filled the room. The guests stood motionless. Champagne glasses remained frozen halfway to lips. The whispered conversations had stopped completely. Even Christopher's smug expression had started to fade, replaced by something that looked almost like confusion. Tommy moved into the more complex middle section, his fingers dancing across the keys with increasing confidence. He'd practiced this part so many times that his hands knew what to do without conscious thought. The music swelled and fell, carrying everyone in the room along with it. When he finally played the last note, letting it ring out and fade into silence, Tommy opened his eyes. For a long moment, nobody moved. The silence stretched out, and Tommy felt panic starting to creep back in. Had he messed up? Was it terrible? Then Mrs. Harrington began to clap. Slowly at first, her wrinkled hands coming together with deliberate precision. Others joined her, then more. Within seconds, the entire room was applauding, and some people weren't just clapping, they were wiping their eyes. Tommy looked up from the piano to see his mother crying, her hands pressed to her mouth. But these weren't tears of fear anymore. These were tears of pride. And Christopher? He was standing completely still, his arms no longer crossed, staring at Tommy like he'd just seen something impossible. The applause seemed to go on forever, but Tommy barely heard it. His heart was still racing and his hands were shaking now that the music had stopped. He'd actually done it. He'd played in front of all these people and somehow impossibly they'd liked it. Christopher's face had gone from smug to stunned to something that looked like anger mixed with embarrassment. His jaw was clenched tight and Tommy could see a vein pulsing in his temple. This clearly wasn't how he'd expected the evening to go. "That was lovely, dear," Mrs. Harrington said, stepping forward. Her voice was kind but measured, the way rich people talked when they were being polite to someone they still considered beneath them. "You have natural talent. Where did you learn to play?" Tommy opened his mouth to answer, but Christopher cut him off. "Wait," Christopher said sharply. "That was one piece. One piece he's probably practiced 1,000 times until he memorized it." His voice was getting louder, drawing everyone's attention back to him. "Anyone can memorize a song. That doesn't make you a real musician, Christopher," Mrs. Harrington said with a warning tone. But Christopher wasn't finished. Tommy could see the desperation in his eyes now. This guy had spent years and probably hundreds of thousands of dollars on his education, and some kid in worn-out sneakers had just made him look ordinary. He wasn't going to let it go that easily. "I'll prove it," Christopher said, walking over to a cabinet against the wall. He pulled out a folder of sheet music and flipped through it quickly, selecting something near the back. He strode over to the piano and slapped the pages down on the music stand. "Here, sight read this. If you're really talented, you should be able to play something you've never seen before." Tommy looked at the sheet music and felt his stomach drop. It was complicated, really complicated. The notes were packed densely on the staff with sharps and flats everywhere, strange time signatures and markings he didn't fully understand. This wasn't like the classical pieces he'd taught himself. This looked like something written specifically to be difficult. "Christopher, this is hardly fair." An older gentleman in the crowd spoke up. "That's a modern composition. Even trained pianists need time to prepare something like that." "He called my playing emotionless," Christopher shot back. "Said anyone can hit the right notes." "Well, let's see if he can even do that much with something challenging." Tommy stared at the sheet music. His sight-reading skills weren't great. When he practiced, he usually listened to a piece online first, learned it by ear, and used the sheet music as a guide. He'd never tried to play something this complex just by reading it cold. His mind was racing, panic starting to set in. "You don't have to do this," his mother said, appearing at his side. Her hand was on his shoulder, gentle but firm. "Tommy, let's just go." This is enough, she was right. He'd already proven his point. He'd played beautifully, earned genuine applause from people who'd started the evening thinking he was invisible. He could walk away now with his head held high. His mother wouldn't lose her job over this, not after that performance. They could go back to their quiet life and maybe things would even be a little better now. But then Tommy looked at Christopher's face. At that satisfied smirk creeping back, the certainty that Tommy would back down, the assumption that the maid's kid had reached his limit, that there were places he simply didn't belong. And Tommy realized something. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who'd ever been told they weren't good enough because of where they came from or how much money their family had. "I'll do it," Tommy said quietly. "Tommy, no," his mother whispered urgently. "I have to, Mom," he said, looking up at her. "I have to try." Maria's eyes filled with fresh tears, but she nodded and stepped back. She understood. Maybe she'd been where Tommy was now, facing a moment where backing down felt worse than failing. Tommy turned back to the sheet music and studied it carefully. The room had gone quiet again, everyone watching to see what would happen. He could feel Christopher's eyes on him, waiting for him to fail. Tommy scanned the first few lines, trying to make sense of the complex notation. The piece started with a rapid series of arpeggios in the right hand, while the left hand played a counter melody. At least that's what he thought it was. Some of the markings were unfamiliar to him. He'd have to guess. Tommy placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The first few measures were rough. His timing was off and he hit a couple of wrong notes as his eyes struggled to read the music fast enough. Someone in the crowd made a sound. Maybe disappointment, maybe satisfaction. Tommy kept going. His sight reading was clumsy, but he pushed through, determined not to give up. Then something interesting happened. After the first page, Tommy started to hear the pattern in the music. His ear, trained by 2 years of teaching himself by listening, began to fill in what his eyes couldn't quite process fast enough. When he wasn't sure about a note, he'd play what sounded right. Sometimes he was wrong, but often he was close enough that it worked. The music began to flow more smoothly. Tommy stopped thinking so much about the technical challenge of reading the notes and started listening to the story the music was telling. It was an angry piece, full of sharp dissonances and surprising rhythms. But underneath all that complexity, there was something human, something that reminded him of frustration and struggle. He played that feeling. Where his sight reading failed him, his musical intuition took over. He made mistakes, plenty of them, but he played through them with such conviction that they almost seemed intentional, like he was adding his own interpretation rather than simply getting things wrong. The room was completely silent except for the piano. Tommy had no idea what anyone was thinking. He was too focused on the music, on making it through to the end without completely falling apart. His fingers hurt, his back was tense, and sweat was beading on his forehead, but he didn't stop. When he reached the final measure, Tommy played the last chord and held it, letting it ring out before carefully lifting his hands from the keys. He sat there for a moment, breathing hard, afraid to look up and see the disappointment on everyone's faces. He'd made so many mistakes. Christopher had probably been counting every single one, but then the applause started again. Not as thunderous as before, but genuine, warm. And it wasn't just polite clapping. People were nodding, smiling, looking impressed. That was remarkable, the older gentleman who'd spoken earlier said, stepping forward. He had gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Young man, I'm Robert Chen. I teach at the Riverside Academy of Music, and I've been doing this for 35 years. What you just did shouldn't have been possible." Tommy looked up at him, confused. "But I made so many mistakes." "Oh, you absolutely did," Mr. Chen said with a gentle smile. "Your sight reading needs work. Your hand position is unorthodox. You missed probably a third of the notes as written. But you know what you did instead? You understood the music. You felt what the composer was trying to say and you played that. Most of my students with years of training can't do what you just did." Christopher made a scoffing sound. He butchered it. "That's not what the composer wrote." "No," Mr. Chen agreed, turning to face Christopher. "But he captured what the composer meant. There's a difference. Technical perfection is important, yes. But music isn't mathematics. It's communication. It's emotion. This young man communicated something real, even through his mistakes." Mrs. Harrington was studying Tommy with new eyes, like she was seeing him for the first time. "How long have you been playing?" she asked. Tommy hesitated. This was the moment of truth. He could lie, minimize it, try to protect his mother's job. Or he could tell the truth. 2 years, he said. "I taught myself, from library books and videos online, and I practiced here in your music room when nobody was around. I'm sorry, I know I wasn't supposed to." The room went very quiet. His mother looked like she might faint. This was it, the confession that could cost them everything. Tommy waited for the anger, the outrage, the order to leave and never come back. But Mrs. Harrington surprised him. Her stern face softened and something that might have been respect flickered in her eyes. "You taught yourself in 2 years, she repeated slowly. "Self-taught. No formal lessons at all." "No, ma'am," Tommy said. She looked at Mr. Chen. "Robert, in your professional opinion, what does this boy have?" Mr. Chen didn't hesitate. "Raw talent. The kind you can't teach. The kind that comes along maybe once every few years if you're lucky." He turned back to Tommy. "With proper training, you could be extraordinary, but what I hope you never lose is what you have right now. That ability to make people feel something real when you play." Christopher stood off to the side, his expression unreadable now. The smugness was gone, replaced by something more complicated. Maybe acceptance, maybe respect, or maybe just the realization that expensive schools and famous teachers couldn't buy what Tommy had naturally. Tommy looked at all the faces around him. These people who'd seen him as invisible just an hour ago were now looking at him like he mattered. like he was somebody. It was overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful all at once. His mother was crying again, but she was smiling through her tears. Whatever happened next, they'd gotten through this moment together, and Tommy knew, sitting there at that piano with his hands still trembling, that his life had just changed forever. The rest of the evening felt like a dream Tommy wasn't sure he wanted to wake up from. Guests kept approaching him, asking questions, offering compliments. A woman in a diamond necklace told him her daughter took lessons and didn't have half his passion. A businessman pressed his card into Tommy's hand, saying something about potential sponsorships. It was all too much, too fast. Tommy's mother stayed close, her hand protectively on his shoulder. She smiled politely at everyone, but he could feel the tension in her grip. This kind of attention was dangerous. Good things didn't usually happen to people like them. There was always a catch, always a price to pay. Mr. Chen had stepped aside to talk quietly with Mrs. Harrington. Tommy tried not to stare, but he couldn't help glancing over at them every few seconds. They were discussing something serious, both nodding occasionally, looking back at Tommy. His stomach churned with anxiety. What were they planning? Christopher had disappeared into the crowd. Tommy spotted him near the bar, downing a glass of something amber-colored, his face still flushed. Part of Tommy felt bad for humiliating him, but another part, the part that had been invisible for so long, felt a spark of satisfaction. Maybe that made him a bad person. He didn't know anymore. Tommy. Mrs. Harrington's voice cut through his thoughts. She was standing beside him now with Mr. Chen at her side. We need to talk. You, your mother, and me. Privately. Maria's hand tightened on Tommy's shoulder. Mrs. Harrington, I can explain about the piano. Tommy didn't mean any harm. He was just, Maria. Mrs. Harrington held up her hand. This isn't a reprimand. Please come with me to my study. They followed her through the mansion, past the ballroom still full of mingling guests, down a hallway lined with family portraits, and into a wood-paneled office that smelled of old books and furniture, polish. Mrs. Harrington gestured for them to sit on a leather sofa while she settled into a high-backed chair across from them. Mr. Chen stood nearby, his expression thoughtful. First, Mrs. Harrington began, I owe you both an apology. Maria, you've worked for my family for 3 years. Your son has apparently been here just as long, and not once did I bother to learn anything about him. Not his name, not his interests, nothing. That reflects poorly on me. Maria looked stunned. Mrs. Harrington, you don't need to apologize. We're just what? The old woman interrupted gently. Just the help. Just not worth noticing? She shook her head. I've spent my whole life around privilege, Maria. I thought I understood how the world worked. But watching your son play tonight reminded me of something I'd forgotten. Talent doesn't care about money or status. It shows up where it wants to, in whoever it chooses. Tommy sat very still, afraid to move or speak. This didn't feel real. I had a piano teacher coming here twice a week for 2 years, Mrs. Harrington continued, teaching my granddaughter Victoria. She never wanted to learn, complained through every lesson. Meanwhile, your son was teaching himself in secret, during stolen moments with no resources and no support. The irony isn't lost on me. I'm sorry, Tommy said quietly. I shouldn't have used your piano without permission. Mrs. Harrington waved her hand dismissively. That piano has sat mostly silent for years except for Victoria's half-hearted practice sessions. At least someone was making good use of it. She leaned forward, her eyes sharp and focused. Mr. Chen has made you an offer. I'd like to hear it, and then I'd like to make one of my own. Mr. Chen cleared his throat. Tommy, the Riverside Academy is one of the finest music schools in the state. We provide comprehensive training for students from ages 12 to 18. Based on what I saw tonight, I'd like to offer you a spot in our program. You'd need to audition formally, of course, but that's really just a formality at this point. Tommy's heart leaped, but then reality crashed back down. I can't afford that, he said. Schools like that cost thousands of dollars. Which brings us to my offer, Mrs. Harrington said. I'd like to provide a full scholarship. Tuition, books, any fees associated with the program. Everything covered. The room went silent. Tommy looked at his mother, whose eyes had gone wide with shock. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like them. Why? Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why would you do this? Mrs. Harrington was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant. Because 60 years ago I wanted to be a painter. I had talent, real talent, or so my art teacher told me. But my family said painting wasn't a proper occupation for a Harrington. So I gave it up. Married well, raised children, managed the estate. I had a good life by most measures, but I always wondered what I might have become if I'd been allowed to chase my passion. She looked at Tommy directly. I can't get that time back, but I can make sure another young person doesn't lose their chance. Tommy felt tears prickling at his eyes. I don't know what to say. Say you'll work hard, Mr. Chen interjected. Say you'll show up ready to learn. Because I'm going to be honest with you, Tommy. You have incredible raw talent, but you've also developed some bad habits teaching yourself. Your hand position needs correction. Your sight reading needs serious work. Your understanding of music theory has gaps. It's going to be challenging, and there will be days when you'll feel frustrated. I can handle that, Tommy said quickly. I want to learn. I want to get better. Mr. Chen smiled. That's what I hoped you'd say. Students with your natural gift sometimes get arrogant. They think talent is enough. But the students who really succeed are the ones who understand that talent is just the starting point. The real growth comes from discipline and dedication. Maria was crying now, quiet tears rolling down her cheeks. This is too generous. I don't know how we could ever repay you. You don't repay it, Mrs. Harrington said firmly. You pay it forward. Someday when Tommy is successful, he helps another young person who needs a chance. That's how this works. There was a knock at the door and Christopher entered. He looked uncomfortable, his earlier confidence nowhere to be seen. Grandmother, I need to speak with you. We're in the middle of something, Christopher. I know. That's what I need to talk about. He looked at Tommy and something complicated passed across his face. I was a jerk out there, I know it. And watching you play, I realized something I've been avoiding for a while now. Everyone waited. Christopher took a breath. I'm good at piano because I've had the best training money can buy, but I don't love it. Not the way you do. I can hear the difference. Everyone can hear the difference. I play because it's what's expected of me. You play because you need to, like breathing. He rubbed the back of his neck. My family has connections at Riverside Academy. I was planning to recommend a friend for a scholarship they offer. But after tonight, I think you should have it instead. Tommy stared at him. You don't have to do that. Yeah, I do, Christopher said. Because you're right. Music should have feeling. And maybe if I'd loved it the way you do, I would have figured that out sooner. He extended his hand. No hard feelings? Tommy stood and shook his hand, still processing everything that was happening. An hour ago, Christopher had been mocking him. Now he was offering help. People were complicated, Tommy realized. They could be cruel and generous, petty and noble, sometimes in the span of a single evening. There's one more thing, Mrs. Harrington said. Maria, I'm promoting you to estate manager. It comes with a significant raise and better hours. I need someone I can trust running this household, and you've more than proven yourself. Plus, with Tommy's new schedule, you'll need flexibility. Maria put her hand over her mouth, overwhelmed. Mrs. Harrington, I don't know what to say. Say yes, the old woman replied with a slight smile. And call me Victoria. We're going to be working closely together. Tommy looked around the room at these people who'd just changed his life completely. Mr. Chen, who saw potential where others saw only a poor kid. Mrs. Harrington, who'd recognized a second chance when she saw one. Christopher, who'd set aside his pride to do the right thing. And his mother, who'd sacrificed so much to give him any kind of life at all. When do I start? Tommy asked Mr. Chen. Fall semester begins in 6 weeks. That gives you time to prepare. I'll arrange for you to meet with some of our faculty members beforehand. Get assessed properly, figure out what you need to work on most urgently. He pulled out a folder from his briefcase.
This is the curriculum overview and a practice schedule I'd like you to follow.
2 hours a day minimum. Can you commit to that? Yes, Tommy said without hesitation. Absolutely. Mr. Chen handed him the folder. Then welcome to Riverside Academy, Tommy. I have a feeling you're going to do great things. As they left Mrs. Harrington's study and walked back through the mansion, Tommy clutched the folder to his chest. The party was still going in the ballroom, but the music sounded different now. Everything sounded different. The whole world had shifted, opening up in ways he'd never imagined possible. His mother squeezed his hand. I'm so proud of you, mijo. Your father would have been too. Tommy hadn't thought about his father in years. The man had died when Tommy was 6, leaving them with nothing but memories and struggle. But maybe in some way this was for him too. For everyone who'd ever dreamed of something better and never got the chance. They stepped outside into the cool evening air. The stars were bright above them, and for the first time in his life, Tommy felt like he could reach them. 3 months had passed since that night at the Harrington mansion, but Tommy still sometimes woke up thinking it had all been a dream. Then he'd look around his new bedroom, bigger than the one he'd shared with his mother in their old apartment, and reality would sink in. This was real. All of it was real. The move had been Mrs. Harrington's idea. Well, Victoria's idea, as Tommy was learning to call her. The estate had a guest house that nobody used, and she'd insisted Maria and Tommy take it. "You'll need to be close by anyway," she'd said in that matter-of-fact way of hers that made arguing impossible. "And Maria, as estate manager, you should be on the property." Their new home had 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living room with windows that let in morning sunlight. It wasn't fancy by Harrington standards, but to Tommy and his mother it felt like a palace. Best of all, Tommy was allowed to practice on the Steinway in the main house whenever he wanted. The piano that had once been forbidden was now his to use freely. The first day at Riverside Academy had been terrifying. Tommy had walked through the doors in his new clothes, bought with money from his mother's raise, carrying the leather bag Victoria had given him. "Every serious student needs a proper bag," she'd said. Inside were notebooks, pencils, and sheet music Mr. Chen had assigned him to study. The other students had money, Tommy could tell immediately. They had expensive instruments, talked about summer programs in Europe, and wore confidence like a second skin. He'd felt like an imposter, waiting for someone to realize he didn't belong there. But then he'd met Daniel, a quiet kid with glasses who played cello. Daniel's family owned a restaurant, and he was there on partial scholarship, working weekends to help pay for the rest. "Most of these kids have been playing since they were 5, Daniel had told him at lunch that first day. "But that doesn't mean they're better than us. It just means they started earlier. We've got something to prove, and that makes us work harder." Tommy had found his people. Students like him and Daniel, kids who'd fought for their spot at the academy and weren't going to waste it. They practiced together, pushed each other, stayed late in the practice rooms working on difficult passages until they got them right. The classes were intense. Music theory made Tommy's brain hurt at first. All those rules about harmony and counterpoint and chord progressions. His teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was patient but demanding. She'd corrected his hand position so many times in those first weeks that Tommy had wanted to cry in frustration. Everything he'd taught himself, she was asking him to unlearn and rebuild properly. "I know it's hard," she'd said one afternoon when Tommy was particularly frustrated. "But bad habits will limit how far you can go. We're not tearing down what you built, Tommy. We're giving you a stronger foundation so you can build even higher." She'd been right. After a month of focused work on technique, Tommy could feel the difference. His playing was cleaner, more controlled. He could tackle pieces that would have been impossible before. The gift he'd always had, that natural feeling for music, was still there. Now it had structure supporting it. Mr. Chen checked in on Tommy's progress regularly. He'd sit in on lessons sometimes, nodding approvingly or offering suggestions. "You're doing well," he'd told Tommy after a particularly good session. "Better than well, actually. You're exceeding my expectations, and I had high expectations to begin with. But the academy wasn't all work." Tommy had made friends, real friends who shared his passion. There was Lisa, who played violin and had a laugh that could fill a room. Kevin, a pianist like Tommy, who'd become his friendly rival, pushing each other to improve. And Daniel, steady and supportive, always ready with encouragement when things got tough. They'd formed a small ensemble, playing chamber music together. Tommy had never played with other musicians before, and discovering that connection, where 4 separate parts came together to create something bigger than any of them alone, felt like magic. Christopher had surprised Tommy by stopping by the academy one day. He'd found Tommy in a practice room, working through a particularly difficult Chopin piece. "Sounds good," Christopher had said from the doorway. Tommy had stopped playing, unsure what to say. Their relationship since that night had been cordial but distant. "I wanted you to know," Christopher continued, stepping into the room. "I'm not going back to Vienna. I told my family I'm done with music, at least professionally. I'm going to study business instead." "Oh," Tommy said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," Christopher shook his head. "I should have figured this out years ago. Music was never my dream. It was my grandmother's dream and my parents' expectation. But watching you play that night, seeing what real passion looks like, it made me realize I was living the wrong life." He smiled slightly. "So thanks, I guess, for helping me figure that out." They'd talked for another hour, and Tommy had discovered that Christopher was actually pretty decent when he wasn't trying to prove something. He was smart and funny, and he genuinely seemed happier now that he'd stopped forcing himself to be someone he wasn't. The biggest change, though, was in Tommy's relationship with his mother. Maria had blossomed in her new role as estate manager. She'd always been competent, but now she had authority and respect. Tommy would watch her giving instructions to the staff, managing schedules, coordinating with vendors, and barely recognized the worried woman who used to work herself to exhaustion just to make rent. "Are you happy, Mom?" he'd asked her one evening as they ate dinner in their little house. She'd looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Happier than I ever thought possible, mijo. Not because of the money or the house, though those are wonderful, but because I get to watch you become who you were meant to be. That's everything to me." Victoria had become an unexpected mentor. She'd started painting again, setting up a studio in one of the mansion's unused rooms. Sometimes Tommy would find her there, covered in paint, working on a canvas with fierce concentration. She'd shown him her work, landscapes full of color and emotion. "It's never too late," she'd told him. "I lost 60 years, but I still have whatever time I have left. And I won't waste it." She'd looked at Tommy seriously. "Don't waste yours either. You've been given a gift and an opportunity. Use them." The Academy's winter concert was coming up. Tommy had been chosen to perform a solo, which was almost unheard of for a first-year student. He'd selected Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the piece that had started everything. But this time, he'd be playing all three movements, including the explosive final section he'd been working on for months. The night before the concert, Tommy couldn't sleep. He went to the mansion and let himself into the music room. The Steinway sat there in the darkness, waiting. He turned on a single lamp and sat at the bench, placing his hands on the keys without playing. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, about being invisible and finding the courage to be seen, about his mother's sacrifices and Victoria's generosity, about Mr. Chen's belief and Christopher's unexpected friendship, about all the people who'd been part of this story. Then he began to play softly just for himself. The music filled the quiet room, and Tommy felt that same sense of rightness he'd always felt at the piano. This was where he belonged, not because of where he'd come from or who his family was, but because of the music itself, the universal language that spoke through him when he played. The concert the next evening was packed. Victoria sat in the front row with Maria, both dressed elegantly. Mr. Chen was there, along with all of Tommy's teachers. His friends from the academy filled several rows there to support him. Even Christopher had come, sitting near the back with a genuine smile on his face. When Tommy walked onto the stage, he wasn't nervous. He'd played for hostile crowds before. These people wanted him to succeed. He sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and looked out at the audience. He found his mother's face, saw her pride and love, and smiled. Then he played. The music poured out of him, everything he'd learned in the past 3 months combining with the natural gift he'd always had. His technique was better, his understanding deeper, but the emotion that had always been his strength was still there, stronger than ever. He played the slow, haunting first movement, the delicate second movement, and finally the furious, passionate third movement that left audiences breathless. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. But Tommy barely heard it. He was thinking about the boy who used to sneak into this very music room, pressing keys so softly no one would hear, dreaming of a life that seemed impossible. That boy had been brave enough to challenge someone far above his station, brave enough to risk everything for one moment of being seen. And that moment had changed everything. As Tommy stood to take his bow, he understood something important. Talent mattered, opportunity mattered, hard work mattered. But what mattered most was the courage to step into the light, to claim your place in the world even when everything told you that you didn't belong there. He'd been the invisible boy, the maid's son, the kid who wasn't supposed to touch the piano. Now he was Tommy Rodriguez, student at Riverside Academy, a young musician with a future full of possibilities. And he was just getting started. The audience rose to their feet, the applause continuing as Tommy smiled, finally allowing himself to believe that he deserved this moment, this success, this life. His mother was crying happy tears. Victoria was beaming with pride, and Tommy felt something he'd never quite felt before. He felt like he was home,